Hello, my name is Derek Lovett. I'm a science teacher at Lanier High School. I participated in the Teachers Improving Practice Cohort 2021-2022, cohort number 2. I want to share just a little bit about my experience with the cohort. I really thought the approach to how the instructors conducted the sessions was effective in that I began to use strategies before I ever was really aware that I did. And it's because they had us doing a lot of collaboration and a lot of just practical things in the trainings. And so, probably after the second session, is when I actually began to formally implement the strategies. And that was after I had reflected on what I had actually been using in the classroom. So, prior challenges I had before the training was with differentiation. I was able to focus on struggling students one on one, but what I had been trying to do was make differentiation more systematic, where it wasn't such a burden to focus on individual students. I wanted it to be more holistic and just fluid, and I struggled with that. Another aspect that I struggled with was introducing new activities. New activities pose challenges with getting supplies, making sure the material was meaningful, and just managing the classroom while conducting those activities. And those things were a challenge. So, what would happen is I would have these ideas to implement activities, and then sometimes I wouldn't do them because of the difficulties with implementation. And finally, I struggled sometimes with engaging all students. I was able to engage those students that were there and focus, and then I was able to engage the middle of the road students, but oftentimes I might lose the interest or engagement of my struggling students. What I would like to do is give you a brief overview of the strategies, and then I will take you through how I use these strategies with a particular topic that I covered in 10th grade physical science. Space memory retrieval is the concept of having students recall information by requiring frequent but spaced use of the material. Association simply implies that students make associations with existing knowledge. And then variation in regard to number one and number two is simply helping students to form different ways of recalling the information through varying the associations while continuing to space those associations and the recall of the information. It's important that we create a sense of progress that's uh, been proven psychologically as a source of intrinsic motivation for all of us. Using models, patterns, and small steps. It's just this concept of providing a framework for students and adding on in increments. Then finally, beginnings and endings. The main objective of the beginning is to invoke curiosity. The main objective of an ending is to create a sense of progress and accomplishment. So both of these serve to engage students and motivate them to want more and to want to put forth the effort. One of the topics we cover in physical science is electricity. I use circuits, which is simply an energy source such as a battery with one end connected to a wire and then connected to whatever the component is that you're trying to power, say a light or a fan, and then connect it back to the wire, which is connected to the other end of the energy source. So, what I found through the training was that it was much easier for me to just allow my students to get started with something hands on, as opposed to me trying to give them theory and trying to give them stringent guidelines for how to go about the activity. So, what I found very effective was just giving students a manual, giving them the materials, and telling them to build something. What I found was as students worked together, naturally, they corrected each other, they helped, they began to ask questions, and this invoked that sense of curiosity. So this was the beginnings, but not only that, it invoked a sense of progress because they were able to complete something. And because they had each had projects such as a fan or a car that actually ran, it was something very relatable for them, which invoked other questions. For instance, the young man here, he built a car with his partner, and the car simply would go forward or could go backwards. But his next question was, how would a remote control be used to control the direction of the car? And this flowed right into the next topic, which we covered weeks later, which was waves and radio waves. And so I was able to refer to his question as we moved into the next topic and even challenge him to continue his own research. In addition, students who finished with their bills early were able to experiment with different components and then reflect on the challenges of working together and following the guidelines. So this also emphasized the importance of paying attention to detail, which is a key element of science. After this introduction, I then introduced them to the concept of electricity and sources of electrical energy. One way I did that is showing them a video about how a battery could be created simply with a lemon and wires, and how that lemon was chemical energy that was converted to electrical energy and could light up a small light bulb. And that served as a foundation for the simplicity of electricity. And from there, we drew a schematic of a circuit and we defined key vocabulary words such as voltage, current, and circuit. And in addition to that, students were able to reflect on the models that they had built and how these vocabulary terms actually applied to their model, as well as how the lemon related to the battery. And so we were able to talk about chemical energy and that process of converting that energy to electrical energy. And we were able to review what we had talked about, protons and electrons and the movement of those charged particles. The next day, I introduced the concept of Ohm's law, which is simply the relationship between voltage, current, and resistance in a circuit. And we referred back to our vocabulary as we discussed series and parallel circuits. So now what we have is memory retrieval. So that's that space memory retrieval because they had to remember the vocabulary and relate it to their notes. But also, this was a new form of association because before they were able to associate electricity with the models that they built, now they were associating it with the schematic diagrams and the concept of series and parallel circuits. From this point, I introduced our next activity. In this activity, students were placed into groups and they were challenged to configure a circuit, and they had the liberty to create the circuit any way they wanted to. The catch was once they configured their circuit, they couldn't change it, but they had to observe what worked within their circuit. They had to write down why it worked, and that allowed them to recall their knowledge of series and parallel circuits. They also had to draw the circuit. And after they did that, they were able to configure another version of the circuit. And they were at liberty to try to make it work based on their observations or just configure something, whatever they wanted to. But again, they couldn't change it after they configured it. And then they repeated those same steps of making an observation, writing it down, drawing it. And so each group did this. And again, what this allowed them to do was create an association with these models again. So now, and these are the incremental steps that are happening, because initially they built the model of something that existed that they could relate to, such as the car. Then they were introduced to the concept of series and parallel circuits, which they wrote in their notes. Then they were able to actually build on both of those with this configuration, because they were challenged to configure something, and most of them naturally were trying to get the lamp and the fan or whatever else working. So this got them really thinking. So this is the variation at work. This is the incremental steps at work. This is association at work, and it's space memory retrieval, because it's calling on knowledge that they've gained over the last few class periods. In addition to this, while groups were working on this, they were also challenged to try to solve problems with series and parallel circuits that I had introduced to them the day prior, and they would get points or some kind of reward for doing so. And this group activity spanned a couple class periods, because I used some of that first class period to review Ohm's law. So for that second day, groups continued to solve problems with series and parallel circuits, except the problems got more complex. I added a step. So there's the concept of incremental steps again. And of course, most students want to know, did they solve the same way? And the answer was yes. But they had to refer to their notes. But they were challenged to think about how to incorporate that additional step. So they had to refer back to their notes, talk amongst each other, and use the notes as a framework to figure out how that additional step could be incorporated into solving the problem. Finally, on the last day, students were introduced to a device called a multimeter, which is used to measure current and voltage. And we only used it to measure voltage. But this was another form of association, because whereas students had calculated current and voltage using Ohm's law on their papers, now they were able to actually use the multimeter to measure the voltage for a series and parallel circuit. So now they were able to relate voltage that was on their papers that they had calculated for series and parallel circuits using Ohm's law to the voltage that they were able to get by using the multimeter. So what was interesting about this is even students that had come in late, say they had missed the last week or 2 weeks of class, this is where I would start with them actually to help them get an understanding of what we had covered in depth. And how it worked was I would allow them to configure the circuits, first the parallel and then the series, and I would show them how to measure voltage across each component, a light bulb and a fan and the battery, for a parallel and for a series, and they would record the voltage that they got. And for those who were new, I would explain to them the difference between voltage for a series and parallel circuit. Those who had been there, I would challenge them to look at the differences and, based on Ohm's law, provide an answer for why there was the difference in voltage. And then I would ask all the students one question. I asked them, if you were trying to power a lot of appliances in your home at one time, what type of circuit would you use, series or parallel? And all of the students, 100% of them, were able to answer that they would use a parallel circuit in lieu of a series circuit. And the concept behind that is a parallel circuit distributes an equal amount of voltage to each component, so such that each component has enough to power itself, to be powered on. Whereas the series circuit, the electricity only has one path to flow, and those components have to share that electricity. So some of those components are not going to get enough to be powered on. And they all understood this concept just from this small activity. So that was our ending. It gave students a sense of progress, even students that had missed all the other classes. And for those students who had been there, it gave them a sense of progress and clarity. And this was also an opportunity for students to test their calculations. So some students were even able to play around with the multimeter and try testing the current and the voltage, and then making calculations using Ohm's law based on the current that the multimeter specified. So overall, observed results, it definitely increased student interest by using this strategy of beginnings and endings and getting students started without the need for all the theory up front, and just allowing them to develop the process. And I believe that was just the epitome of it being student-centered, and it was also the epitome of incorporating the arts, the writing, drawing, and just the teamwork, allowing students to just create what they wanted to, make inferences, reach conclusions through the natural process of that. I believe that epitomized the arts in STEAM. It increased engagement. Instruction became easier because much of the class sessions had to do with students actually trying out things and reflecting and really learning concepts. And it was them doing it, and I acted as a guide instead of trying to constantly give them theory and help them understand. Students understood by trying. And this allowed all of the students, even my struggling students, to get involved and have a sense of progress because they had something to contribute. Moving forward, I would like to continue to organize this process, and I would like to make it such that all of my topics begin with activities that are drawn out over a week or two, while theory is embedded after student inquiry. And I challenge them by adding steps with increased levels of complexity. So overall, it was a great experience, and it totally enhanced and transformed my approach to instruction. Thank you.